Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report, reporting to you on the global insurrection against the banker occupation. There are revolts everywhere. They're all attacking the corrupt bankers. We're going to get into the headlines. I want to introduce Stacy Herbert. Stacy, hi.
Hi, Max Keiser.
Yeah.
I have a headline for you, and you're going to give us some comments on it.
Yeah.
9/11 crybabies needed to pick cotton for $2 a day. I ask you to comment on this because it is your headline.
Yeah, I wrote that on my site. I talk about these 9/11 crybabies. Since 9/11, there's been an effort to make sure there's never another 9/11. But of course, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to the American economy, because if you're competitive, if you're trying to expand your global franchise, you got to take risks, and you got to take the risk of being hit with an occasional 9/11. Every 10 or 15 years, there should be a 9/11 to show that America's got a pulse, that it's out there actually expanding its business franchises around the world. The fact that there hasn't been shows up in the statistics in terms of loss of competitiveness, high unemployment, and the control by kleptocrats. So the U.S., the Americans, if you want to get back in the game here on the global competitive stage, you should wish for another 9/11. All right, so let's go to the headlines.
But you bring up this notion of 9/11, and this is something that also triggered a very deep partisanship in America. It also allowed for the looting of America via unfunded wars. And this is the phenomena we've referred to before, where that famous psychological experiment where you're told to watch the black shirts and the white shirts playing each other in basketball, and you have to count the number of times they pass the basketball back and forth to each other. And into the experiment runs a gorilla. Most people don't see it. And that's, I think, what we see in the global economy. Nobody ever sees bankers running through the crime scene because we're too concentrated on whether or not how many Muslims are getting into the country, or how many red states are getting unfair advantage, or how many women union members are getting unfair advantage.
That's right. Since 9/11, the kleptocrats, and I'm talking about the Koch brothers and Scott Walker in Wisconsin, play the divisive game. They play the sectarian game, red state, blue state game, to try to divide people. And everyone's cowering in fear, and they're losing their mojo in America. They can't compete anymore. And whenever they should just bear down, put their shoulder to the wheel, and anticipate another 9/11, because that's the best thing that could happen.
It's not the best thing that could happen, actually. When people orchestrate these attacks, they do it in order to divide and conquer. So the next time it happens, they should know better that this is what happens. And we see this through all of our next headlines.
Just a quick point. When you're learning to ride a bicycle, you fall down occasionally. That's what happens when you go through, they call it creative destruction in economics. It's the same thing in politics. It's the same thing in empire building. So don't reject it, accept it.
Squatters take over Saif Gaddafi's London home. So this is a protest group called Topple the Tyrants. And they've seized what it describes as the Libyan government's corrupt and stolen assets that their own prime minister, of course, helped the Libyan government steal.
That's right. That's right. Tony Blair made it possible for Gaddafi to steal incredible amounts of assets. Now the protesters are squatting at a Gaddafi-held property in London, and they want their money back, of course. And we should see this all over the world, too. People should squat outside Scott Walker's house and demand that back, because that was stolen with public taxpayer money.
Well, they're seizing the house. It's they squatted in it until the assets are sold and given back to the Libyan people. It's 10 million pounds. But in the meantime, going with this theme of the gorilla running through the room, their own economy has been taken. They're paying austerity measures in order to finance the banker heist. Lord Hutton's public sector reforms. Who will lose out? So Lord Hutton, remember, who whitewashed the whole Tony Blair regime.
And put the BBC totally on the back foot during the Hutton inquiry.
Well, that's correct. But he's come up with these new public sector reforms in which workers in the public sector will face a radical overhaul of their pension schemes. But here's a paragraph that stood out to me. More public sector employees who are now living and drawing a pension for longer has created an estimated 30 billion pound black hole in the public finances. So 30 billion pound black hole. And people are outraged that these public sector sponges, who's stealing all our money from us. Did you see any outrage for these two headlines? One from 2009. Bank bailout to add up to 1.5 trillion to public debt. That's from 2009. Here's from the end of 2010. Ireland bailout, UK taxpayers could face £7 billion bill for some bondholders in a bank that didn't even have deposits.
That's right. So this $30 billion black hole, the point is that the non-public sector union workers could just as easily fight to get a $30 billion raise so that there's parity in the worker space, that workers would get some kind of decent wage, instead of fighting amongst yourselves and letting the bankers, the crooks, the terrorists get away scot-free. They're complete idiots. And it's the same thing in the U.S. in this Wisconsin thing. The public pensions are being attacked as well. They're morons.
But all you see is David Cameron, or in the U.S., you see the whole Obama administration. They all came in on this wave of unrest about the banking theft. And in office, both of them have only targeted workers making like $50,000 a year, not the guys who stole $50 trillion. And the population immediately falls into, that guy's making $50,000. I wouldn't make that ever in my lifetime working at Walmart.
If anyone can send me an example of a campaign promise that Obama did not break, I'll wear a dress on this show.
I'm going to find one.
Good luck. The guy has been 360 degrees of disappointment, a total, utter fraud, and a punk.
Well, here's some more guerrilla bankers running through the rampaging through the global economy.
Let me just make a quick comment here. If you want to see these gorillas, go to a YouTube, search the Phantom Gorilla YouTube, and you play this with yourself. You'll see that it works. You're focusing on the basketball players, and you totally miss the gorilla running through the frame. This is what Stacy is saying, is that people are focused on the stupid stuff, and they miss this gorilla walking through the frame that's stealing all the money.
Cengiz brothers arrested in Kaupthing raids. So these are brothers Vincent and Robert Cengiz were arrested by the Serious Fraud Office and the City of London Police. The Serious Fraud Office is investigating allegations of market abuse, fraud, and excessive loans. Financial claims against Kaupthing Bank run to 5 times Iceland's GDP. SFO and Icelandic officials started an investigation to ascertain whether substantial value was extracted from the bank in the weeks and days before it collapsed. Yeah, it needs a very expensive investigation paid for by the taxpayer of the UK to see whether or not there was any fraud involved in that.
Well, line up these SFO guys in a room, take out a large frying pan and bonk them on the head, and see how much money they spend investigating whether or not they just got bonked in the head with a frying pan. I mean, the country just got looted. Your job is to go after the looters. Oh yeah, I forgot, you're brain dead.
But again, Kaupthing Bank owes the UK £2.5 billion, okay? No, so much less anger over that by the population than against a public sector union worker. And also, one of these Kaupthing Bank guys arrested was the former treasurer of Kaupthing Bank. After the collapse of the bank, he then went to work for the FSA, the Financial Services Authority in the UK.
Yeah, it's an amazing amount of corruption in Iceland and the UK, exceeded only by the banking corruption in Ireland.
And it's also London, as these guys topple the tyrants, are looking at some guys in the Middle East. In their midst are running wild these bankers looting all the world and using London as a safe harbor.
Yeah, they're totally blind to the looters amongst them. They're in denial. It's not just a river in Egypt.
So here's another headline. Don't get mad, get even. So this is in Wisconsin, the whole Koch brother Scott Walker story. Labor vows to recall Wisconsin GOP lawmakers fight anti-union bill in court. So Governor Scott Walker, Republican of Wisconsin, and his Republican allies in the state Senate took nearly everyone by surprise and pushed through a standalone bill stripping public employees of their collective bargaining rights. And, you know, to the media, they always say it's the public sector unions. They keep on talking about that we're just getting rid of these unfair advantage they have. They never mention that the exclusion to this bill are firemen and police unions. The unions they're targeting are teachers and nurses, which are almost all female. So right. This is that sectarian divide and conquer. You know, psychologically, many in the religious fundamentalist sort of base of the Republican Party will endorse that the women should be in the home anyway.
Well, this guy, Scott Walker, obviously doesn't want to pick a fight with a fireman or a policeman because he's a bully. He's afraid of a man, a real man, somebody who's not a pencil-necked, you know, sausage-breathing, nincompoop, troglodyte, policy-making, Koch brothers, underwear-sucking moron. And so anything that's against women women he'll be endorsing because he's an embarrassment to Wisconsin. He's an embarrassment to America. There should be a regime change of Wisconsin. This guy's assets should be seized. He should be thrown in jail. He was caught committing acts of tyranny with the Koch brothers. He's a criminal, and no punishment it would be too cruel.
And so because of all these banking gorillas, again, looting and plundering everybody, money continues to be printed and printed and printed. So headline reads, warning of food price riots in the UK. A senior economist at the worldwide bank HSBC has warned of civil unrest in Britain if food prices continue to soar. She said, quote, even in the developed world, I think we have very, very low wage growth. So people aren't getting more in their pay packet to compensate them for food and energy. And I think we could see social unrest, certainly in parts of the developed world and the UK as well. She doesn't blame the money printing that's going on in order to bail out the bankers. She blames high energy prices, which in turn leads to more biofuels. So you can see what the scapegoat here will be. It'll be not on the bankers, not on the banking gorillas running rampant through our economies. It'll be on ecologists and people like this.
Peasants are funny. You know, they just a few generations, most of these people complaining, they come from peasant stock, they're returning to peasant stock. God bless you. Good luck, indentured servants. You never had any civil rights. You never had any legal rights. It's pre-Magna Carta. Get back in the ditch and start digging. And, that was a dream. Democracy never happened for you or your family. It's over.
So finally, Max, she does, however, point out the very low wage growth, she says, and she emphasizes that this is a big problem as prices continue to rise. But all of those very low wage growth people, they respond by saying, make my neighbor also make less money,
right,
not me make more.
Right, we've talked about this many times before. Workers are tricked into believing that they should tie their wages to inflation or CPI, and those numbers are cooked by the government so that they don't have to pay wages and they don't have to pay anybody retirement benefits. If you're smart and you're a worker, if you're a cop, if you're a fireman, if you're a nurse, you do real work out there, you're not a hedge fund guy who's just spinning paper and trading on inside information, you should bargain to have your compensation tied to money supply growth. If the UK's money supply growth by 10% or 15% a year, then so should your wages. Otherwise, you're cooked. Your goose is cooked. But wait a minute, money supply, that has 4 syllables. Oh no, it might be too much for you to handle. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to San Francisco and speak to Richard Heinberg of the Post-Carbon Institute. Richard is the author of several books, including The Party's Over, Blackout, Peak Everything, which I happen to have read myself and found to be extremely interesting, and his new book, The End of Growth. Richard Heinberg, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Good to be with you.
All right, Richard Heinberg, your latest book is called The End of Growth. Tell us about it.
Well, the book, unfortunately, is not out yet, but it makes the controversial claim that world economic growth has hit non-negotiable limits as of 2008, and that we're in a new economic era. It's not a recession that will end at some point and we'll get back to normal growth. Rather, we have seen the end of economic growth as we know it. In fact, this shouldn't be a big surprise. The best-selling environmental book of all time back in 1972 was called Limits to Growth, and it forecast that sometime in the early 21st century, resource depletion and population growth would lead us into a cul-de-sac such that world economic growth would cease. I believe we're at that point, and it's largely because of oil prices, which essentially are forming a cap on economic growth. If the economy starts to recover, that pushes oil prices up, and when oil prices go up, they undercut economic activity. So all the cheap, easy oil is gone. It's not that we're about to run out of oil, but the price of extraction and exploration is rising rapidly. So at this point, I believe energy prices are effectively capping economic growth.
Okay, so going back a ways, early years of the London School of Economics, there was Thomas Malthus. He came up with the Malthusian Dyer prediction, which set the stage, as a matter of fact, for the entire field of economics being referred to as the dismal science, in that there would be, of course, arithmetic growth of resources versus geometric growth of the population, that we'd run out of resources, the economy would come crashing to a halt. But what he didn't count on is innovation, technology, and everything we've seen since that time. Why is this time different?
Well, right. The biggest thing that Thomas Malthus missed was the fossil fuel era. He had no way of knowing that there would be enormous amounts of cheap energy available to fuel economic growth and also to fuel industrial agriculture, which nobody dreamed of in Malthus's time. Even as recently as the 1980s and 1990s, there was a strong argument that resources would not get more expensive because of innovation, as you say. We would just get better at extracting lower and lower grades of resources. Well, since 2000, the situation has turned around. They were just making the bet too early. And I think Malthus was essentially saying what he said too early as well. He said that there would be limits to food supplies if population keeps growing. I think he's absolutely right. We're seeing food prices going through the roof right now, as well as energy prices. These limits are elastic to a certain extent. We can push them out with efficiency, with energy efficiency, with more global trade, by using more energy to extract lower grade resources and so on. But there are limits to all of those strategies, and I think we're reaching those limits as well.
All right, let me ask you a question. I heard something recently. I want your comment on it. It has to do with the amount of debt that's in the global economy. And the hypothesis is as follows. To pay off this debt requires a certain amount of growth. And of course, in our modern 21st century world, growth means oil-driven growth. And the commentator that I read was suggesting that the amount of growth it would take to generate the ability to pay off this debt versus the amount of oil in the ground that could be burned to engineer that growth does not exist. In other words, we have more debt than we have oil to burn to finance the retirement of that debt. Are you familiar with that equation? And if so, could you comment on it?
Well, I think that's probably true. But the point is really that we've created all of this debt to fund economic growth. We have even created modern currency as a form of debt. We loan money into existence. So without increasing levels of debt, we have no way to increase the money supply to fund economic growth. Now, this seemed to make sense in decades past when we had lots of cheap energy with which to make the economy grow. But as energy resources get more scarce and expensive, not only oil, but coal as well. As that happens, then we end up with this huge debt overhang. There's no way that those debts can ultimately be paid off. And this is effectively what happened in 2008. We had the bursting of a housing bubble. House prices couldn't keep increasing forever. But also in 2008, we had the oil price spike up to almost $150 a barrel. And those two things together, the bursting of the housing bubble and the oil price spike, sent the economy into a tailspin. We remember the housing bubble, but most people forget about the oil price spike. But they're not going to forget for long because the same thing's happening this year again.
All right, tell us about the Goldilocks syndrome, as you call it, your thoughts on how markets may respond to this resource scarcity.
The Goldilocks syndrome is a term actually invented by a New York Times writer. I didn't invent it, but I think it's a really good metaphor to use for the situation we're in, because we need oil prices to be within a certain narrow band in order for the economy to function. These days, to fund exploration and production, oil companies need prices in the range of at least $70 per barrel. That's because all the cheap, easy stuff is gone. We've used the low-hanging fruit principle of resource extraction for looking for oil, and we have gotten all of the low-hanging fruit.
Richard Heimberg, you're near San Francisco, north of San Francisco. You're in an area, of course, near Silicon Valley, which is the home of entrepreneurialism and venture capital and social networking sites and Apple Computer and all these whiz-bang, shiny, glossy little products coming off the assembly line. And it seems, tell us about what's happening on the ground there in San Francisco. Is there an awareness of this peak everything phenomenon? Or is there this blithe kind of belief that technology is going to save the day? Is there a comprehension there in San Francisco, or is everyone just going to continue to play the venture capital game?
I think if you took a poll of the general population here in Northern California, you'd get a strong majority of people believing that innovation can continue to solve our problems in perpetuity, and we don't really face any fundamental resource limits. But as I say, that is changing. As oil prices go up, as food prices go up, people start to get worried. And I guess their worry is that innovation can't keep up, and we're not investing in it enough. But I would go further. I would say that there are basic limits to what we can accomplish with efficiency, substitution, innovation. We're hitting those. I think not many people would agree with that yet.
Now, I've seen a phrase being bandied about on the various financial websites a lot. It's the phrase buyflation, which is different than stagflation. Buyflation is commodity prices rising while wages are deteriorating. Do you buy into this phrase, and what does this phrase mean, if you have a comment on that?
Well, I think that is what we are seeing and what we are going to see. And I think not many financial commentators really understand what's behind it. Not many of them would agree that it's a result of fundamental scarcity. That, as I've said earlier, we've reached the low-hanging fruit. We've already picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of oil, coal, natural gas, minerals, fresh water, fish, forests, et cetera, et cetera. And so as time goes on, we're inevitably having to expend more effort to harvest resources, and that effort is energy. So if energy itself is also becoming more scarce, then we get into this cul-de-sac. And therefore, even if we can raise wages with inflation, prices of basic resources are going to rise faster than wages.
Right. So unlike the periods of inflation in the past, or even the stagflation of the 1970s, you did have, of course, there was a lot more union representation at that time. You did have wages at least keeping up to some degree with what was happening on the inflation front. Okay, so let's look forward a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. What does a post-carbon economy look like?
Well, it looks smaller than the economy we see around us today, and it's also more localized because globalization is based on cheap transport fuel. So as transport fuel gets more expensive, that changes the equations with regard to comparative advantage and globalization. So we will see more production regionally. Now, it doesn't mean that global trade will go away overnight or altogether at any point, but it is going to shift. Also, we're going to need to become more generalists rather than being more and more highly specialized. More and more of us are going to have to know how to grow food, how to take care of ourselves in terms of healthcare and so on. And so that's really going to change what daily life looks like. It's not just going to be a matter of hopping in the car and rushing over to the other side of town to buy a new flat screen TV. we're going to be more concerned about providing basic necessities for ourselves. A good pair of new shoes, for example, is going to be a much bigger deal for us in 5 or 10 years than it has been.
Okay, well, that's the book is coming out in hopefully in a couple of months. It's
right.
Called The End of Growth. It's a follow-up to Blackout and Peak Everything, which basically is exactly what it says. It's about all various natural resources. We're now in the end game as the neoliberal industrial model has eaten up all of the cheap availability of these resources. So I look forward to seeing when the book comes out, The End of Growth. Richard Heimberg, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
It's been great talking with you, Max. Thanks.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Richard Heimberg. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.